Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today centers on one of the most compelling and I think potentially disruptive developments in recent Irish archaeology. We're looking at the intensive study of a huge concentration of prehistoric settlements in County Wicklow, specifically the findings around the Baltinglass hill fort cluster.
It's an incredible area. This research, which focuses on what some are now calling Ireland's hill fort capital, really does force us to reconsider the timeline of societal complexity on the island. The scale of what was built there is, well, it's just undeniable.
It absolutely is, and that brings us to our central question. Does the sheer scale, the sophistication, and the incredible longevity of these prehistoric population centers, does it all necessitate a fundamental redefinition of what we even mean by a town or urbanism? And crucially, does this evidence finally challenge that long-held narrative that the Vikings were the very first people to establish towns in Ireland? I'm going to argue that the archaeological evidence proves that sophisticated permanent settlement agglomerations, true proto-towns, existed long before the Viking Age, and that we really need to revise our history books.
It'd all be arguing that while we absolutely have to recognize the astonishing size and complexity of these sites in Wicklow, the distinctive functional, economic, and architectural character of the later Viking settlements remains the essential and consistent benchmark for what we call the emergence of true urbanism in Ireland. Scale, in my view, does not automatically equal urban function.
Okay, so my position rests very heavily on the recent understanding of this Baltinglass hill fort cluster. And to really grasp the significance here, we have to understand the time frame. This cluster spans an enormous era, from the early Neolithic around 3700 BC, right through to the end of the Bronze Age, about 800 BC. That is a continuous political and social center lasting for almost 3,000 years.
It's a staggering period of time, certainly.
Staggering. Exactly. I mean, this is not a scatter of seasonal encampments or temporary farming shelters. This massive settlement complex is now being characterized by leading archaeologists as a nucleated settlement agglomeration, basically a dense cluster of powerful, permanent sites. It comprises up to 13 large hilltop enclosures, including at least 7 major hill forts, all of them strategically placed across this sort of necklace of hills. We see a really complex stratification in how these sites were used. Rathcaran and Spinon's Hill, for example, show their origins way back in the Neolithic. Then later sites like Rathnagree and Strahan were enclosed in the Middle or Late Bronze Age. This continuous, multi-generational investment in monumental construction, in defense, and labor organization, it indicates a level of political and resource control that just far surpasses the concept of simple agrarian villages. This community was able to organize labor and sustain itself as a massive center of gravity for thousands of years. This evidence, I think, forces us to look beyond the idea that Ireland was just a politically unsophisticated backwater until the Vikings arrived and founded places like Dublin and Waterford. The sophisticated social engineering was happening centuries, even millennia before.
That is a very compelling statement of the sheer antiquity and scale. But I believe the debate really hinges on the precise functional definition of the word town. While I completely acknowledge the extraordinary nature of the Baltinglass cluster, we have to avoid confusing a powerful, sustained political capital with what is a genuinely urban mercantile center. The traditional, and I would argue still accurate, historical view defines urbanism based on the economic and political purpose of the later Viking settlements. These settlements, emerging around the 9th and 10th centuries, they flourished specifically as specialized trade centers and ports. They weren't just big, they were centers where the majority of the population was engaged in non-agrarian pursuits, things like trade, craft, and industry. I think we have to apply a consistent historical definition. Consider complex early medieval Gaelic sites, which were much closer in time to the Vikings. You have the large, protected farmsteads, the raths or cashels, or even these enormous monastic settlements that sometimes looked like towns. A site like Noath, Site M, occupied from the 6th to the 11th centuries, it was a massive political and ecclesiastical center of power. and yet historians generally exclude it from the first town definition. And why? Because these sites were often economically self-sufficient. They lacked the specialized foreign trade drivers that really characterize Dublin or Cork. Urbanism, I think, demands more than just population density or political power. It requires a specialized economic driver and a corresponding structural shift. And the architecture tells a really key story here. Indigenous Ireland maintained the tradition of building roundhouses, a tradition stretching deep into prehistory. The shift toward the widespread use of rectilinear, square or rectangular buildings, that aligns chronologically and ideologically with the later Viking developments. We need evidence of that functional shift to really call Baltinglass a proto-town.
I see why you emphasize economic specialization, but applying a 10th century economic definition to a Bronze Age political center, it risks missing the point entirely. You're creating a definitional barrier that I think ignores this monumental political and social organization that sustained itself for 3 millennia. If we look purely at the ability to organize resources and labor, the evidence from Baltinglass is conclusive. Think about the neighboring megalithic monuments built during the Neolithic period, the Great Passage tombs. These require vast coordinated labor over huge distances, which indicates both status and a deep knowledge of engineering. The sheer effort involved in maintaining that political organization, sustained from 3700 BC onwards, it just suggests an incredibly centralized community structure. You cannot manage that kind of density and maintain those monumental works for thousands of years without a very complex internal mechanism for resource distribution and political control. It may not have had a planned main street, but it was a sustained, powerful political center that was capable of coordinating resources across a vast region.
I hear you on the incredible scale, on the labor organization, but focusing purely on size can be a trap. You could argue the construction of the Egyptian pyramids or the massive stone circles of the British Isles represent profound organization, but we don't call them towns. We need to see functional structures that support a non-agrarian population. Viking towns like Dublin or Waterford, they were distinguished by planned, specialized infrastructure. We see deliberate town planning, recognizable roads, paths leading directly into small, delineated property plots, and highly specialized industrial quarters. Archaeological speculation suggests that, noxious activities like ironworking or specialized antler-working workshops were deliberately sited outside the main defenses or segregated within the town plan. This structural, organized arrangement focused on external trade and craft production. It contrasts fundamentally with the function of a massive hill fort. A hill fort, regardless of its size, remains primarily a center for defense, for storage, or for ceremony for an elite group. Viking towns like Dublin or Waterford, they were distinguished by planned, specialized infrastructure. We see deliberate town planning, and let's just go back to the architecture for a moment. That shift in domestic structures, moving away from the traditional roundhouse to rectilinear buildings, starting around 8800, it suggests profound ideological changes. These square shapes often reflect new concepts of formalized land ownership or potentially the influence of Christian rectilinearity and individualized private space. These structural and ideological distinctions set the later urban forms apart from anything we see in the Bronze Age.
Nullify the clear evidence of complex, sustained settlement. If the evidence of massive labor organization and political gravity isn't enough to call it a proto-town, then maybe the physical expression of that power was the organization of the enclosures themselves.
That's a fair point, but let's look closer at those enclosures. If you contrast the Baltinglass hill forts with the defensive architecture of later early medieval sites, hill forts and ring forts, whether they're the earthen raths or the stone cashels, they were primarily protected farmsteads or residences for high-status dynastic families. Look at the scale of investment in defense. A site like Cahercoman, a huge cashel in County Clare, had an inner wall measuring 8.5 meters wide. The multi-valid enclosures at North Site M, they similarly required massive coordinated labor. But this construction primarily denotes status, military protection, and control over agrarian resources by an elite family. it does not necessarily denote a dynamic market-based economy capable of supporting that high density of specialized, non-agricultural workers that define a town. Their function, it seems, remained rooted in localized political control.
I think that interpretation focuses too narrowly on the typical agrarian ring fort model. We have mounting evidence for specialized industrial activity in non-enclosed or less fortified settlements that clearly functioned as specialized hubs and trade centers in the early medieval period, before the established Viking ports. Take, for example, the incredibly rich unenclosed sandhills site at Dewey in County Donegal. Now, this wasn't a fortress. It was an open occupation area dating up to the 8th century. And what did they find there? Evidence of specialized, broad-based industrial activity, extensive ironworking, fine bronze working, specialized antler working, and even dye making using local resources. It's now theorized that Dewey functioned as a kind of beach market, strategically situated on the North Atlantic seaways, acting as a trade hub connecting Northwest Ireland and Scotland. Take, for example, the incredibly rich, unenclosed sandhills site at Dewey in County Donegal. Now, this wasn't a fortress. It was an open occupation area dating up to the 8th century. And what did they find there? Evidence of specialized, broad-based industrial activity. This example proves that complex trade, industrial specialization, and exchange were powerful indigenous economic drivers before Viking dominance, and they did not require the architectural signatures you're demanding. The Baltinglass sites, spanning millennia and controlling vast labor pools, could easily represent the political centers, the inland capitals of this powerful earlier economy. Their power was expressed through monumental landscape architecture and sustained political organization, rather than the rectilinear property plots of a later mercantile system.
Your point on Dewey is a strong one, and it illustrates that indigenous specialization certainly existed and may well predate the Vikings. But that just brings us back to the threshold of urbanization. How do we acknowledge the extraordinary power of Baltinglass without making the definition of town meaningless?
Well, we have to avoid applying anachronistic, high medieval criteria to Bronze Age achievements. This reluctance to acknowledge prehistoric settlements like Baltinglass as Proto-Towns, it risks favoring structural definitions that were invented centuries later. We need to weigh the material evidence of longevity, sustained population density, and political organization equally alongside those functional economic characteristics. The deep roots, the complexity, the longevity of the Baltinglass complex, they should weigh heavily when defining a foundational settlement, regardless of whether it conforms architecturally to a later 10th century port. It was the political foundation upon which later societal complexity was built.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a final perspective on that definitional gap, specifically using those later Gaelic examples. If we accept the Baltinglass complex as a proto-town, then where do we stop? Even highly sophisticated early medieval settlement types that are far closer in time and function to the Viking sites are still not termed towns. Consider the Royal Crannogs, those fascinating artificial islands like Lagor and Moynog Lough, occupied from the 6th to the 9th centuries. These were the absolute pinnacles of secular power, royal residences with extensive evidence for high-status specialized crafts, metalworking, huge wealth. And yet, they are universally not counted as Ireland's first towns because they were primarily self-sufficient elite centers, not mercantile hubs built to facilitate sustained external trade. Consider the Royal Crannogs, those fascinating artificial islands, like Lagor and Moynog Lough, occupied from the 6th to the 9th centuries. These were the absolute pinnacles of secular power. This demonstrates, I think, that historians are already applying a consistent, high threshold for urban status that's linked specifically to sustained, specialized, non-agrarian economic drivers. That threshold remains incredibly difficult to prove empirically for the Bronze Age Baltinglass cluster, regardless of its influence or size. If we simply conflate massive, politically specialized fortresses with nascent urban economies, we just blur the essential distinction between a ceremonial or political capital and a mercantile city.
Consider the Royal Crannogs, those fascinating artificial islands like Lagor and Moynog Lough, occupied from the 6th to the 9th centuries. These were the absolute pinnacles of secular power. So, to summarize, the sheer scale, the population density, and the extended timeline of the Baltinglass Hill Fort cluster from 3700 to 800 BC, it provides compelling archaeological justification for recognizing complex, nucleated settlements millennia before the Viking Age. While structural and functional differences certainly existed, they didn't have a Viking-style planned marketplace, denying the Proto-Town status to such organized, long-lived centers, well, it reflects a chronologically biased definition of civilization that favors 10th century standards over 3rd millennium BC achievements.
And I maintain that the economic and structural characteristics, namely planned infrastructure, specialized foreign trade, and a population primarily engaged in non-agrarian pursuits that we see in the later Viking-founded towns like Dublin, Waterford, and Cork, that they define the critical and functionally distinct transition to true urbanism in Ireland. The Baltinglass sites represent the undeniable pinnacle of prehistoric ceremonial and political organization, but the specific economic shift we define as urban remains, I believe, rooted in that later period.
It's clear that the complexity of early medieval and prehistoric settlement in County Wicklow, and Ireland generally, requires continual intellectual challenge, and it certainly suggests there is much more detail and perhaps many more definitions to be uncovered in the material.
I agree.